Let's get started now with our program, and we begin with a subject that is absolutely central to what the Global Learning Council is all about. Namely, to what degree lessons learned in one culture can be, potentially at least, applicable in others. The working group number 2 has been comparing different countries' experiences in technology-enhanced learning, examining the nature of variations in how students from different cultures respond, and exploring how to overcome obstacles and barriers, particularly where resources and technology are limited. So let's hear now about the best practices that they've identified. It is my pleasure to welcome to the stage 2 members of Working Group Number 2. Amy Ogan is the McCandless Early Career Chair of Human-Computer Interaction at Carnegie Mellon University, and Judith Uchitiuno is a PhD student and Presidential Fellow at CMU, and she's been working on ways to better support English language learners in online courses. So the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and good morning. So glad to see you all today, particularly all of you from all over the world, as this Global Learning Council has brought you here together today. We'd very much like to thank the Global Learning Council for putting together the initiative to work on this very important topic, which is often a difficult one to find funding and support for. And so we're very excited to be working on this, the second of our 2 working groups on this topic of, well, what we initially started out to believe would be best practices for TEL in global cross-cultural contexts. But as we went along, we found that we'd be talking to you today about fundamentals for TEL in global cross-cultural contexts. And perhaps next year we'll be able to present on best practices. All right, so the question we are asking is, are there really cultural differences in teaching and learning? Or is it perhaps instead just a question of student motivation and the prior knowledge that they bring to an experience? If there are such cultural differences, are these something that we actually need to address as we develop our educational technologies and our pedagogies? So in today's talk, what we'll be doing is presenting a small subset of the studies that investigate these questions. And secondly, we'll be talking about some proposals for dealing with these findings. All right, and so how did we go about doing this? Well, first, we started off with reading, synthesizing, and writing up 639 papers. And of course, as we were doing this, we found that they couldn't come from just one source. We had to gather these from across educational psychology, learning sciences, anthropology, critical theory, artificial intelligence in education, learning at scale, mobile learning, and on in order to be able to find the scattering of work that deals with these questions. So we've been summarizing that work. In addition to that, we've conducted 20 interviews with international students and 8 with what are called flying faculty, or faculty who work in one place and fly off to teach at a branch campus somewhere else. And here you can see the set of sites where those faculty are working. In addition to that, our group personally has done field work in over 10 countries in 5 continents, where we've been working in schools and in homes and looking at issues of education and technology in education across a wide set of socioeconomic status, ethnicities, genders, etc., to try to look at how these issues actually play out in the real world over longer periods of time. So you can see here also the sites where we've been doing that work. So this is where we started. And one of the most important things that I'll give you this picture again. One of the most important things that we found as we got started, particularly with the work in these papers, was that culturally aware technology-enhanced learning needs more learning scientists. Why is that? Well, in particular, what we found from a wide set of review papers was that up to 93% of the participants in our studies are weird. And by weird, I mean that they come from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and developed countries. All right, so this should perhaps give us some pause as we consider if this is true, does our learning science work actually apply to students who come from places outside of these venues? And the reason why we should be asking ourselves that is that an excellent paper by Henrik et al. In 2010 pulled together the literature in cognitive and social psychology to find that psychology insights that are thought to be universal in many cases do not hold in these non-weird countries and contexts. So if this is true in psychology itself, should it not also be true for the learning sciences? And so what we wanted to do here was to give you just a little taste of the sort of things that came out of Henrik's paper on psychology in general, starting with some differences that they found, for example, in even something as fundamental as color perception. All right, so I'm going to show you a video from the BBC of this excellent study.
Can you do the same thing again?
This is what they're looking at. For us, it's quite hard to spot the odd one out.
Okay, can you point one more time towards the different color? Very good.
But for the himba, it's easy to see the green, which is different.
So you see, in this particular trial, this green patch looks very much like the other ones, at least to me, and I think to most other Westerners. Whereas for the himba, this is a different color. Well, they have a different word for this type of green compared to the other types of green. And that allows them to more easily distinguish between these two colors when they're next to each other. Whereas for her, it is very hard. So when Westerners do this exact same trial, they will spend much longer and they will be much more likely to make a mistake than the himba.
The next experiment is trickier for the himba. In this one, they are shown a circle of green squares, which includes one blue square. For us, we have separate words for green and blue. But as the himba have the same word for both, it takes them longer to spot the blue.
Can't see it.
Wow. So the first time I saw that video, I couldn't believe that something that I thought was universal was so completely impossible for a group from a particular place in the world who had had particular experiences in their lives to be able to detect. And so what we are arguing here is that our learning science principles as well are rooted in cultural and political practices, and therefore we need an investigation into whether we are making assumptions about whether they hold across cultures, and to what extent we need to address these issues in the design of our learning environments. Okay, so today we're going to tell you a little bit about what we found, a very small set of papers that look at some of these cultural influences on teaching and learning. We're going to talk about the results that are, I would say, in their infancy on our results with culturally aware technologies for education. And then Judith is going to present to us some of the proposals from the literature for how to scale this work up. And in doing so, one of the perspectives that we're going to take is that education is also about communication. And so we're going to divide our literature into two parts. The first talking about semantics and syntactics, or really the language that we use to communicate about information about the world. And secondly, pragmatics. So that is the norms, beliefs, contexts, and motivations that surround when and where and why to use our language skills to communicate new information. All right, so first we'll talk about some results in syntactics and semantics. Okay, so of course you probably all agree with the idea of translation. If we cannot understand a particular language, we can't learn the material in that language, and so we need to be able to translate in order to send our educational materials out to a new country. So that one's fairly obvious, right? Okay, so translation, but it turns out that mathematical symbols also vary widely, despite the idea that maybe math is some sort of universal language. And in fact, Erica Mellis has a fantastic paper that shows us about the variations by language, country, application, region, community of practice, etc., in which these mathematical symbols vary. So we'll think about a simple example here. All right, take a look at this number. Now raise your hand if you think this number is less than 10. Less than 10? All right, and how about more than 10? Wow, actually we're at about half and half here. All right, now imagine you're a student and you see one of these numbers coming up on your interface, and you have to try to decide, have we now invented an entirely new numerical system? What's happening? There are 2 decimal points in my new number, right? Imagine the confusion for students when even something as simple as this variation isn't accounted for in their software. All right, now let's think about something as simple as division. So here's an American approach at doing long division. The 8 is on the left. Here's a Spanish approach at long division. Now the 8 has moved over to the right. And even in another region within Spain, we don't have a consistent view of how to do long division. 8's still on the right, but now we've got this crazy symbol where it's upside down to me from my American perspective. And so in fact, in our own field work, I was once in Latin America with a group of teachers from 4 different neighboring Latin American countries who had no idea that their neighbor to the northwest or south used a completely different approach for doing long division that would, and their students weren't able to pick up on the differences between them. All right, so these are really simple, but if we think about this variation even within a language and within a country, we see a very similar phenomenon when we think about language as a whole. And quite a few studies, an enormous number of studies, more than we were able to put up here, have shown that when students are taught to read in their native dialect, the one that they speak at home, this significantly increases their comprehension and their speed at gaining literacy. And so this is something that was found in the 60s and the 70s, an extensive amount of work, and we're still not putting into practice in our educational technologies and in our pedagogies today. All right, so that was a little bit on language, and now we'll move over to the idea of pragmatics, or the contexts, motivations, all of the beliefs that shape the way we use this language. All right, and here's one that I think is really interesting because it addresses a principle that I hold fairly dear in my work as an educational technologist, which is that of learner autonomy. So we should allow learners choices in the work that they do in order to motivate them the most deeply to succeed in their own work. Well, it turns out that this is also not a universal concept. So students in America were given the choice to do a learning task selected for them by the experimenter, selected for them by their mother, or selected on their own. They could make their own choice. And as you might expect, the Americans worked harder at and performed best at the activity that they themselves chose. When this exact same activity was given to Asian learners, maybe you can guess, the choice by their mother was the one that was most successful, both for time on task as well as for performance. And in fact, a related idea, which contradicts some of the principles that we hold dear here, is that a study in Singapore showed that the more students were motivated by performance goals and competition, the higher their achievement. Whereas in the United States, we typically think that goals towards mastery and deeper learning are the ones that are going to be the most successful. All right, so that's dealing with learner autonomy and motivation. We see similar differences in how students engage in classroom conversation, which is a critical part, as we've been talking about over the last 2 days, of how learners engage with their peers, their teachers, and the materials that they're working with. And so there are a number of very interesting results here as well. It's fairly commonly cited that students in Confucian heritage cultures participate less in class, and so that would be students in Korea, Vietnam, China, etc. And in fact, a wide-scale study showed that only 6% of 8th grade students in Shanghai would even consider talking in the middle of class. Something that we talk about a lot, participation, discussion, and the need for student contributions. Now, what's really important here is to understand why that might be the case, to determine whether we would like to support that practice or whether we would like to change it. And so a great study across 3 Confucian heritage cultures showed that the majority reason that students cited for not wanting to do this was in order not to take away valuable class time by interrupting the teacher and preventing other students from learning. So without understanding the underlying reasons why such an effect might be occurring, it's impossible to make decisions about how to proceed with our own educational materials. Similarly, with respect to classroom conversation, in the United States, a large-scale study found that Native American students offered shorter contributions and fewer contributions. They interrupted the teacher more, and they gazed at their peers rather than the teacher when the teacher engaged in the typical sort of classroom conversation, where one student would talk and then the teacher would ask, does anyone agree, or could anyone offer another opinion? So these students participated less and engaged less and interrupted their teacher more. However, a subsequent study showed that when the format for participation changed, in other words, they allowed overlapping talk. They let the kids talk whenever they wanted and offer contributions at any time. These same students increased their participation. They increased the length of their contributions in class. And not only that, but their reading scores increased as well. So we have to understand the reasons why these phenomena are occurring. And we also need to understand what practices enable these students to flourish. All right, so that was a small set of studies that are just looking at these influences of culture on pedagogy. But let's talk a little bit now about how they may or may not transfer when we're talking about the introduction of technology into the classroom. So one of the things that we're able to do with technology that's really cool is the ability to provide conversational partners for students that are able to talk with them and engage them in learning conversations, such as this virtual agent that you see here today. So this is a growing trend in educational technologies, and there have been several studies now that have shown that when these intelligent agents are able to speak using the student's home dialect, that we see the same effects as we do when this dialect shows up on paper. And so here's a study in which students significantly increased their science learning scores with an agent who spoke in their home African American dialect compared to an agent that spoke in mainstream English. All right. And if we look at some of the pragmatics issues that occur in educational technology, one thing that I've heard mentioned here a lot over the last 2 days is the idea of being able to now, with technology, engage in large-scale educational data mining or learning analytics. So we can now use our technology to collect lots of data, to understand better the processes around learning and the outcomes around learning. And so there's some interesting early early work that has looked at collaboration and these models that lie underneath our intelligent technologies. So here's a group actually from my own field work in Chile. As you can see, 3 students gathered around one machine, even when there are other machines available for them to work on. And by the end of class, 6 students gathered around one machine and working together on solving a tough problem that came up in this mathematical software. And so when we looked at the data, the logs that came out of this system, what we found was that the models that were trying to predict students' help-seeking behavior worked just fine in the United States, where students typically sit down, work diligently at their own machine, and maybe chat a little bit with their neighbor. They were completely unable to predict any of the help-seeking behavior that we saw in our Chilean classrooms, where students were engaging in this very collaborative, communal problem-solving that wasn't happening necessarily on the computer. And in fact, we found that almost 20% of work that these students were doing was actually typing on someone else's machine. All right, so similarly, we see that there have been recent results in looking at students' off-task behavior. So one of the things that you can do with technology is detect when students are off working on something else or not paying attention to the educational materials. And that could happen either to fix the materials or to fix the students. Maybe you need to just find a way to get them to pay more attention. Well, some of the results that have come out of this line of work have shown that students in the Philippines are far less likely to engage in off-task behavior than their American counterparts. And in part, this is because the respect that they feel for the teacher and for the teacher's instruction. So when the teacher tells them to sit down and get to work and engage with their learning materials, these students are actually doing so, unlike our subjects in the United States. And so in order to be able to understand how to resolve these issues, whether there are issues with the pedagogical materials or there's issues with motivating the students, we need to understand when and where and why these behaviors exist. And we're able to do so by collecting this large-scale data with the systems. And finally, one exciting place to go with this work is MOOCs. So we now have massive online courses. These enable us to both test these principles at scale, but also more successfully deploy versions of our systems that might work for one group more successfully than they work for another group. And so here's a study that showed that a very standard 8-minute self-regulation intervention that has been used very successfully with students in the United States in many, many studies. When they put this online at the beginning of a course that global students were taking in a MOOC, it did indeed work successfully for students in individualistic cultures, but this intervention had absolutely no effect for students in collectivist cultures. And so this is one of those places where we might very easily be able to determine who gets this intervention when we take it to scale, and maybe we look for something else to motivate students from these other cultures. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Judith now to talk a little bit about how we might take the rest of these findings up to scale.
Thank you, Amy. So I think for me, the main reason why I love this work so much is my mind is constantly blown in the process of just reading this kind of information and challenging the beliefs that I have as a researcher, things that I hold dear. So as Amy mentioned, culture has a very profound effect on how students learn and how teachers teach. The gift that educational technology gives us is that it gives us the ability to scale up and provide education in ways that were otherwise impossible. The question now for us as educators and system designers is, how do you scale up your learning applications so they are culturally aware? So based on our analysis on frameworks that have proposed ways of making applications culturally inclusive, we came up with two different factors that you have to balance when selecting the right approach for your application, which is balancing learner fit and the scalability of the application, and they often go in opposite directions. So now, before we get in there, we're going to talk about these six most common approaches for making applications culturally inclusive. The first approach is a ground-up approach. So imagine if you're designing for a community where fundamentals such as color perception is different. You really have to get into the community, immerse yourself completely, and observe their practices and design applications for them. If you do this properly, you can meet the students' unique learning needs and maximize their learning outcomes, which is also always something that we want to do as learning scientists. On the flip side, such systems are not very adaptable. You pretty much have to redo the entire process for every culture that you want to transfer this to. And so they're not very scalable as well. The next is this multicultural approach, because we, as students, the world is becoming increasingly global, and we want our children to be able to compete in different parts of the world. So this approach allows you to not only tailor to students' preferences, but also prepare them to compete in another society. So this says, rather than design for an objectivist principle or a constructivist principle, I'm going to borrow the principles from these different worldviews, add some principles, some critical theory, and create this eclectic design paradigm, which will tailor instruction to students' preferences and meet higher or other learning goals, like just in case the institution wants to prepare them to adapt in the global society. Now, this idea of parameterization is really one that balances learner fit and scalability. So assuming we say, okay, there are only certain factors that human beings differ on. I mean, everything about human beings all across the world cannot be fundamentally different. They're just these key things that we want to make sure that we account for. So you take different parameters, for example, does this person come from a very hierarchical society or a very individualistic society? And if they do, you're going to present them with a different system or a different option. With this, and this idea actually has a potential to create a kind of like a global database of cultural factors that not only the system designer can use, but other institutions can take advantage of. And then when you do this, it has two main challenges. The first thing is, how do you decide what parameters to vary people on? So this is a real system that varies people on different dimensions about human interactions, which is how like their interaction and social patterns, the concrete objects that are meaningful for them, and the environments that are most appropriate to meet their mental models. And the second challenge is, how do you determine what parameter value to assign to which student? And so a lot of research studies pick country of origin or like adolescence country, because there's research that says the country that you spend your adolescence is the one that shapes you the most. So there's other metrics, your family, education, and others that you can use to assign students to different groups. The downside to this approach is it is expensive to add more parameters. For you to build something like this, for every single additional parameter that you add, the cost goes up. On the other hand, the more parameters you add, the more tailored it is to the student experience. And this demographic information, the system can store it similar to the way we store student preferences, like in individualized adaptive systems. This next system is really like a scaled down version of the parameterization approach. So you say, listen, I only care about designing for this few cultures. And so I say, okay, this culture, I'm going to pre-assign these parameters that I think are important, and I'm going to design a new system, right? A different system for these different cultures. The problem with this is, it makes big assumptions about cultures that are similar but distinct at the same time. For students from Confucian cultures, for example, that includes everyone from China, everyone from Korea, everyone from Japan. In China alone, there are over 1 billion people, and you are going to assume in this kind of system that they are all the same culturally, which obviously sounds like this is not a good assumption to make. And now in this approach, just localizing the content, assuming you have a classroom in the United States with international students where you cannot just gut the entire system and customize it to everybody's culture, you can do something like just localizing the content. And this really just takes the images, it takes the examples, it takes the text, and it changes it into something that students can identify with culturally. So this is an example of like a lemonade stand. This metaphor would be understandable in the US because we associate like hot summer days with lemonade stand, maybe not somewhat in Nigeria where I'm from. So you can customize these surface level things. And the downside of this is this doesn't take account of like different cultural pedagogical styles, student motivation, things that really have serious implications for how we design technology. This doesn't take account for that. And the final approach is, let's say, you know what, technology is this wonderful thing, and it is, right? And if you hand everyone a piece of technology, they're going to learn in the best way that suits them, right? They're going to learn in a way that best meets their personal preferences. And research studies actually show that such practices or such initiatives have been only successful in very few contexts, even with local staff support. And this is an approach that is often proposed for areas that have limited infrastructure, such as limited power supply, limited internet connectivity, lack of technical staff to support these initiatives. And just like tying back to some of the conversation that Amy was having, there are cultural differences in how we address these infrastructure issues. So, this is the image on what you guys see here on the left, is this Indian classroom that they didn't have a sufficient amount of computers. So they came up with this solution where we are going to assign multiple students to each computer, and in this system, we're going to split the screen so that way each student has a subsection of the screen. We're going to give one mouse to each student. So even though they're sharing the same desktop, they can all have their own computers with one. This system is not going to work in Amy's Chilean classroom where the students want to work with one mouse, they want to work with one keyboard, they want to work on the same problem, but do it collaboratively. And now I'm going to hand this conversation back to Amy, and so she can wrap up the entire discussion.
Thanks. All right. So, over the course of this talk, we've asked whether cultural differences do in fact exist, and we have found that yes, we see lots of studies that tell us that both motivation and prior knowledge is different across different groups around the world. But in addition, features that we may not immediately think of as we're designing our systems, such as our students' social identity, their practices, their values, also come into play, and there's a feedback loop here with respect to the motivations that they feel and the prior knowledges and experiences that they bring into our classrooms. So here we would say that yes, these cultural differences exist, but maybe there are some reasons that we shouldn't address them. Maybe we can overlook these differences. We know that the world is getting smaller, and oftentimes we want our students to be able to compete in a global context, and this global context that uses technology so deeply is often dominated by our weird norms and values. So maybe we want our students to be able to appear to be flexible and adaptable enough to engage in these contexts that will allow them to compete for jobs and economic opportunities. In addition, our designers are already trained in certain worldviews, and so it might be quite difficult for them to engage in designing for another culture. So lots of reasons perhaps to overlook these differences, but as we dug into the literature, we found that these cultural differences do actually matter. And when they're not addressed, what we see is oftentimes a lack of motivation, a difficulty in comprehending the material. Many studies have shown this. And at an organizational level, oftentimes what we find is that when curricula are imported into a new context, we will find a loss of experienced staff, as well as just complete failures of these curricula that aren't adapted to fit the context. On the other hand, on the positive side, what we've seen is that a number of studies that show that curricula based on a model of the culture leads to significant gains in student outcomes. And here's one in particular that saw twice the learning gains for this culturally based curriculum compared to a traditionally taught curriculum. So we find that these cultural differences do in fact matter, and if we're able to find the right solutions to be able to address them, we may significantly impact students' learning as we work towards providing quality educational opportunities for students around the world. Now, how are we going to do this? I'm going to call back to our working group from yesterday and say that not only what we need is an implementation science, but we need a culturally aware implementation science. So Lauren and Richard talked yesterday about thinking about organizational goals as we attempt to find the best practices for fitting technology into a classroom, a university, etc. I would say that we also need to be culturally aware on a global scale as we're working to find the best ways to make sure that a technology that we develop here in Germany can also be successful for students in Tanzania. So our talk ends with this call for a new implementation science that accounts for culture, and we'd love to have a discussion with you about these ideas. Thank you. Thank you. Can we switch to the pigeonhole, maybe? There we go. All right. So we've got 2 votes for, with global migration in mind, would you be able to provide educators with some form of guidance for culturally aware teaching to ease and support integration? Great. So this really brings back up this idea that we presented towards the end of educators who also believe that their students need to be globally competitive, and thinking about, is there an approach that will let us do both at the same time? So Judith, one of the approaches that you presented actually might address that.
Yeah, so the multicultural approach, which is one that says, you know what, instead of designing for this specific worldviews, let's take from everybody and let's also add principles of critical theory, and not only meet student preferences, but we can move them slowly to a kind of pedagogy that is that we believe that is globally competitive. So there are different approaches that can possibly meet this need, if that's the need for the population.
I think at the same time, we are going to end up with teachers who are searching on the web, who are given curricula that are international, and who need to think about how to adapt it for themselves to make it work for the students in their classroom. And of course, we trust teachers to be able to think through the needs of their particular classroom. But one other idea there might be to better publicize some of these lists of parameters, the ways on which various cultures experience and practice teaching and learning differently, and let educators and those who are implementing some of these solutions in the classroom give them this global perspective that lets them think about, well, does this approach match my students? Do I need to shift in this direction in order to make it work for my children? So being able to provide these lists of learning science principles, but how they may vary by culture, and give that to our educators, I think is one way that we might approach helping them understand the various issues at play. Yes. How do you avoid stereotypes while being culturally sensitive? Yeah, that is one issue. Oh, I should mention, so this, of course, was a very short set of the results that we found. We will be distributing a much, much longer document for comment by the GLC members, and we'd be very excited if you wanted to take a look through that and give us your feedback, because we weren't able to present nearly a tenth of the information that we've collected over the course of this year. And in that document, we do talk about how to deal with stereotypes at the same time as being culturally sensitive. And so I think this is where we need to be clear that an approach, for example, such as the very limited set of multiple versions of a system where we might assume that all learners in a classroom fit into one of these 4 values is going to be much more prone to this idea of stereotypes or fitting students into a box. And so I think whatever approach you might choose as you're designing your system, being aware that none of these things are constant, that every student belongs to multiple cultures at the same time. You might be a Native American, but you're also an American, and you're also a global citizen, and you're also an engineer. Being aware that our systems need to be flexible enough to allow students to take a path through it that works for them and not make assumptions is a key component, and I think would lead us towards certain solutions rather than others.
And also with stereotypes, I think we have to keep an open mind that the things that we believe that are true may be flawed. And so keep an open mind to asking people who are entrenched in a certain culture their opinions, or how does this really work? I know I left Nigeria when I was 17, and my perspective of the United States was completely different based on what I watched on TV. But I didn't know the perspective that people in the United States had about people from Africa. I just thought, oh, we lived in this city with big buildings, and we could fly everywhere, we had internet. I didn't know, right? And then I come to the US, and I'm like, wait, this is what they see about Africa? So it's like, there are different things, but you have to keep an open mind and just seek the opinions and the perspectives of people who actually have deeper knowledge about the culture that you're designing for.
Right. So this is one of the reasons why we've done so much field work in our own group, is so that we're not shipping off solutions that we think will work for a particular context and don't really. So another thing that we do is, I showed you 10 countries where we've done work. We couldn't do any of that work without working very closely with local collaborators who understand the context on the ground, who are able to pinpoint any of those places where stereotypes might be existing and where we want to be careful or more flexible about the approaches we're taking. So that's, in addition to this implementation science, I encourage you to work with collaborators from around the globe in order to get perspectives that bring a variety of world viewpoints into focus. All right, let's see. Our next top voted, what learning behaviors are common across cultures that we can build on? Yes. So this is where we come to another one of Judith's potential solutions.
So this is the parameterization approach, where we say, okay, listen, there must be some things, right, that people fundamentally agree on. So maybe, and this is just hypothetically speaking, everybody wants to maybe get educated so they can get a job. And so whatever instruction that you give them has to be economically, in that cultural context, profitable. Maybe that's one common thing, and then we vary on the rest. So this parameterization idea is that you say, on these things, these are like fundamental things that we all agree on, and so let's keep that constant. And for these other things, there are big cultural variations in how we design, how we present, and we can make changes on that. But I think the question that they were really trying to ask us is, can we say the specific learning behaviors that are universally applicable? And I think that I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know about you, Amy.
Well, I think this is exactly the point. Behaviors that we ourselves believe to be universal. In our literature search over the last year, we have found that very often we're able to find something literature that would contradict that. And so I think at this point in time, I do not have an answer to that question, and I think this is why we need the implementation science. However, there are good places to start. One of the papers that we'll cite in the document that you're all welcome to comment on is from Parrish and Vanderhoost, and they've started setting out a set of scales on which they've listed, I think, 25 features of the classroom and where different cultures might fall on a scale for each of those features. So I think that's a really nice place to start. But this is one of those places where they don't have research to back up every feature and every endpoint of the scale. And so that's a great place for learning scientists to step in, take that work, and really show us quantitatively that these features exist. I think our time is up. These are fantastic questions, and we would love to talk to you about them over the rest of the day. And please email us, and we'd be very happy to get into a deeper conversation about any of this. Please read our document and send us comments, and we will be continually editing and working on this to be able to place on the GLC website so that the GLC is able to promote these ideas about fundamentals and hopefully soon best practices for culturally aware technology. Thank you.